The gun was already pressed against Albert Haskins's chest before Henrietta Mercer even realized he had walked through the door. She stood behind the counter of her small general store, her fingers wrapped around the cold barrel of the old Colt revolver she kept hidden beneath the counter, and her heart was hammering so violently against her ribs that she was certain the whole town of Caldwell Creek, Kansas, could hear it. The year was 1882, and the afternoon sun cut sharp golden lines through the dusty windows, and the man standing in the doorway looked like something that had crawled out of her most forbidden memories, the ones she kept locked away so deeply that she thought she had buried them for good. Albert Haskins. He looked different. He looked older. There were new lines carved around his dark eyes, and his jaw carried more shadow than she remembered, and the brim of his worn hat was pulled low the way it always had been when he was carrying something heavy inside him. But it was him. It was absolutely, unmistakably him. The same broad shoulders. The same deliberate stillness that always preceded something either catastrophic or breathtaking. The same way he filled a doorway like he had been carved specifically to fit it. And the gun at his chest was not hers. It belonged to Deputy Frank Colton, who had followed Albert through the door with his face gone white and his voice trembling as he shouted for Henrietta to get back. "Step away from the woman, Haskins," Frank said. "You have got 1 second to explain yourself before I drag you out of here in irons." Albert did not move. He did not flinch. His dark eyes had already found Henrietta across the length of the store, and they stayed on her with an intensity that made the air between them feel like it was vibrating at a frequency that only the two of them could detect. He was reading her face. He had always done that. Even before he ever said a single word, he would read her face the way a man reads a map in unfamiliar territory, looking for the landmarks he trusted most. "I am not here for trouble," Albert said. His voice was low and even and had not changed in 3 years. "I am here for her." Henrietta's breath left her body. That was the sentence she had rehearsed in 1,000 sleepless nights. That was the sentence she had told herself she would never hear, because a man like Albert Haskins did not come back. Men like him were swallowed by the frontier, by the violence and the darkness and the choices they made when the law had nothing left to offer them. Men like him became names on wanted posters that yellowed and curled at the corners until nobody bothered to look at them anymore. But here he was, standing in her store, in her town. In the middle of her life, which she had spent 3 years carefully, painstakingly rebuilding from the ruins he had left behind. "Frank," she said, her voice steadier than she had any right for it to be, "put the gun down." "Henrietta, this man is wanted in 3 counties. Put it down," she said again, and something in her tone stopped him, because Frank Colton had known Henrietta Mercer for 2 years, and he understood instinctively that there was a history in this room that he did not have access to, something deep and foundational and possibly dangerous to interfere with. Albert had not come back to Caldwell Creek on impulse. He had planned this. He had thought it through with the same methodical precision he applied to everything, and it was that very precision, that hidden calculation behind his apparently quiet exterior, that was already tearing Henrietta apart before he had even taken a second step into her store. Because the question that was burning through her, the one that she could not smother no matter how tightly she pressed her composure around herself, was not why he had come back. It was why it had taken him 3 years to do it. 3 years was a long time to not come back for someone. 3 years was long enough for a woman to stop waiting and start surviving. 3 years was exactly how long it had taken Henrietta Mercer to convince herself that she did not love Albert Haskins anymore. She had been wrong about that. She understood this now with a clarity that was almost violent in its sharpness, standing in her own store in the middle of her own life, staring at the man who had walked away from her in the winter of 1879, with nothing but a note left on her kitchen table and the echo of hoofbeats fading into the frozen dark. The note had said, "I cannot stay here and keep you safe at the same time. Do not wait for me, Albert." She had read it 17 times before she believed it. She had believed it for approximately 18 months before she stopped. And now he was here. Now Frank Colton was slowly lowering his gun with the look of a man who understood he was in the middle of something he was not equipped to arbitrate. And now Albert Haskins was crossing the floor of her store toward her with that long, deliberate stride, and his eyes had not left her face, not for a single moment, not even to glance at the door behind him to check for threats, which told her everything she needed to know about how this moment ranked in relation to every other moment he had survived in the past 3 years. She knew she ought to be furious. She was furious. The fury was real and old and well-seasoned, and it lived in her chest right alongside something else that she was not yet willing to name out loud. He stopped on the other side of her counter. Up close, she could see that the lines around his eyes were not just age. They were something heavier. He looked like a man who had been carrying a secret for a very long time, and the effort of it had worn grooves into his face. "Henrietta," he said. Just her name, just that. She felt it like a physical thing pressing against her sternum. "You have got a lot of nerve," she said quietly, "coming back here. I know. You left me a note. I know. You left me a note, Albert, and then you disappeared for 3 years. And now you have walked back into my store with a deputy's gun in your chest. And the first thing you have to say to me is, 'I know.'" Something shifted behind his eyes. It looked almost like relief, which made no sense to her at all, except that she thought perhaps he had been afraid she would not speak to him at all, and the fact that she was already at full volume was somehow reassuring to him. "I need to explain something to you," he said. "You think, and I need you to hear it before you send me away, because I will go if that is what you want. I will walk out that door and you will never see me again. But I need you to hear it first." The afternoon sun moved behind a cloud, and the golden lines on the floor went gray, and the store felt very still and very small. Henrietta set down the revolver. "Start talking," she said. To understand why Albert Haskins had come back to Caldwell Creek after 3 years of silence, it was necessary to understand how he had left, and why, and what had happened to him in the space between then and now. It was a story that did not reflect well on him in the early parts, and he had rehearsed the telling of it enough times that he knew which pieces were most likely to make her look away, and he had decided that he would not soften those pieces, because Henrietta Mercer deserved the unvarnished truth more than she deserved a comfortable narrative. It had begun, as most of his darker chapters did, with a man named Silas Croft. Albert had known Silas since they were both young men in Missouri, back in 1871, when the frontier was still in the process of organizing itself into something resembling civilization, and the law in most places was more of a suggestion than a structure. Silas was 5 years older than Albert and possessed of a charisma that Albert had never quite managed to resist, the kind of magnetic confidence that made a young man feel like the world was a larger and more exciting place simply for being in proximity to it. They had ridden together for 2 years doing work that Albert later described to himself, when he was honest, as operating in the gray space between the legal and the illegal. They moved cattle. Some of the cattle were theirs to move. Some were not. It was a common enough arrangement in that era, when land rights were contested and brands were sometimes freshly painted, and Albert had convinced himself that what they were doing was no worse than what the railroad companies were doing on a much larger scale. But Silas had ambitions that extended considerably beyond cattle, and by 1873 he was running with men whose names appeared on federal warrants, and Albert had made the only clean decision of that period of his life, which was to ride in the opposite direction and not look back. He had spent the next 4 years drifting. He worked legitimate jobs. He drove cattle for a ranch outside of Abilene. He helped build a bridge over a river in western Kansas that was probably still standing. He learned to be useful, and he learned to be quiet, and somewhere in the process of learning those things, the dark energy that had made him susceptible to Silas's gravity began to slowly, partially dissipate. And then in the summer of 1877, he had ridden into the town of Caldwell Creek, Kansas, looking for nothing in particular except a hot meal and a dry place to sleep, and he had walked into the general store to buy a tin of tobacco, and Henrietta Mercer had been standing behind the counter with flour on her apron and a pencil tucked behind her ear, and she had looked up at him with the most thoroughly unimpressed expression he had ever encountered. And something inside Albert Haskins had rearranged itself in a way that he did not fully understand until much later. She had been 24 years old that summer. She had come to Caldwell Creek 2 years earlier with her father, who had intended to open the store and had instead died of a fever in the fall of 1875, leaving Henrietta alone with a leased building, a half-stocked inventory, and a town full of people who were not entirely sure a young woman was capable of running a commercial establishment. She had spent 2 years proving them systematically wrong, and the confidence she had developed in the process was of the particular variety that does not announce itself, but simply operates, which Albert found considerably more compelling than the performative kind. He had found reasons to stay in Caldwell Creek for a month. Then, too, he had taken work at a nearby ranch doing fence repair, which was unglamorous but honest, and he had found himself in Henrietta's store on an increasingly frequent basis, purchasing items he did not particularly need so that he would have reasons to stand at her counter and talk to her. She had seen through this strategy approximately on day 4 and had simply started charging him for the conversation directly, which she indicated by sliding a small receipt across the counter with nothing written on it except a question mark and a price. He had laughed out loud at that, genuinely and completely, which she later told him was the moment she had decided he might be worth her time. They had courted slowly. Henrietta did not do anything quickly that she thought deserved patience, and she thought courtship deserved considerable patience, and Albert had been grateful for this because it gave him time to examine himself honestly, to ask himself whether he was truly the man she deserved or whether he was simply performing the role of that man well enough to fool them both. He concluded that the answer was complicated, which was honest, and he told her so, which she appreciated. What he did not tell her, not in those 2 years of careful, growing, deepening connection, was about Silas Croft. He had not heard from Silas since 1873. He had told himself that silence meant distance, and distance in that era could mean anything. It could mean Silas had settled down. It could mean Silas had been hanged. Either outcome seemed equally possible, and Albert had made the choice that most people make about their dark past when they are in the middle of building something worth protecting, which was to leave it in a box and not look at it. In the winter of 1879, the box had opened itself. A man had ridden into Caldwell Creek on a cold Tuesday afternoon and found Albert at the ranch where he was still working, and the man had delivered a message that turned the world. Albert had been building into something terrifyingly fragile. Silas Croft was alive. Silas Croft was in serious trouble with a group of men who made the federal marshals look like a minor inconvenience, and Silas Croft had apparently told these men, under circumstances that Albert preferred not to imagine, that if they were looking for leverage over Albert Haskins, they should look at the woman who ran the general store in Caldwell Creek. Albert had gone very still when he heard this. He had asked the man 3 specific questions and received 3 specific answers, and then sat in the silence of the ranch bunkhouse for approximately 45 minutes, running through every possible response to the situation with the thoroughness of a man who had learned through hard experience that impulsive decisions in dangerous situations rarely produced good outcomes. The conclusions he reached were these. Staying in Caldwell Creek would put Henrietta in direct danger because the men Silas had told would come looking, and they would use her as leverage, and the leverage would work because Albert's feelings for her were not a secret in that town. Leaving Caldwell Creek and drawing those men away from it was the only way to protect her. Explaining this to Henrietta was not an option he allowed himself, because he had known her well enough by then to know that she would not let him go alone, and he could not allow her to follow him into the kind of darkness he was about to wade back into. So he had left. He had left her a note so spare and devastating that it had accomplished its intended purpose, which was to make her so angry that she would not waste time searching for him. And he had ridden out of Caldwell Creek before dawn, with the cold weight of that decision sitting in his chest like a stone. What followed was the part he told himself he would not soften, because it did not deserve softening. He had spent 8 months tracking Silas Croft down and extracting him from the situation that had endangered Henrietta, which had involved a level of violence and maneuvering that Albert was not proud of. He had spent another 6 months ensuring that the men Silas had dealt with understood clearly that Henrietta Mercer of Caldwell Creek, Kansas, was of no value to them whatsoever, which had required him to make certain agreements and perform certain services that occupied the gray space he thought he had left behind in 1873. He had done this with full awareness of what it cost him in terms of the man he had been trying to become, because the man he was trying to become had not been enough to protect her, and so he had temporarily become a different kind of man, the kind that those men understood and respected and ultimately feared enough to leave alone. By the time Silas Croft was safely across the border into Mexico, and the threat had been neutralized with enough finality that Albert was certain it would not resurface, a year and a half had passed. And Albert Haskins had found himself standing in the middle of New Mexico territory, with a wanted poster bearing his name in circulation through 3 counties, because the activities of the past 18 months had not gone unnoticed by the law. He had spent the following year and a half attempting to do 2 things simultaneously, which were to avoid arrest and to systematically address the circumstances that had produced the wanted posters, which meant working with a lawyer in Santa Fe named Edmund Graves, who specialized in cases involving men who had operated in legally ambiguous circumstances, and who were willing to provide documented evidence of cooperation with federal interests in exchange for consideration. It was a slow process. It was expensive. It required Albert to remain distant from everything he cared about while the process ground forward, but the process had ground forward. And in the late summer of 1882, Edmund Graves had sent him a letter informing him that the warrants in 2 of the 3 counties had been dismissed, and the 3rd was in active negotiation, and that while Albert was not technically free to move about without risk, the specific risk in Caldwell Creek, Kansas, which fell outside the jurisdictions of the 3 affected counties, was manageable enough that a visit would not necessarily result in immediate arrest. Albert had folded that letter and put it in his breast pocket and started riding north the same day. He had not written to Henrietta. He had not sent word ahead. He had known that if he gave her time to prepare for his arrival, she would have time to build her defenses higher than they naturally were, and he needed to see her true reaction before she had time to construct a carefully managed version of it. He needed to know whether 3 years had killed what they had had. He needed to know this before he could decide what to ask of her. What he had not fully anticipated, standing in that store watching the color change in her face and the fury and the something else competing for dominance in her expression, was how completely and devastatingly intact his own feelings were. He had known, in an abstract intellectual sense, that he still loved her. He had known this in the way that a man knows the sun is on the other side of the earth at midnight, which is to say as a certainty that does not require visual confirmation. But standing in her actual presence, watching her set down the revolver with that particular quality of controlled restraint that he had always found beautiful and infuriating in equal measure, was something else entirely. It was the confirmation that no amount of distance or time or deliberately cultivated numbness had managed to change the fundamental reality of what she was to him, which was the thing he was most afraid to lose and had willingly put at risk to keep safe. He told her all of this. Standing on the far side of her counter, with Frank Colton hovering near the door with the reluctant posture of a man who understood he was witnessing something private, but had professional reasons to stay. Albert told Henrietta everything. He left out nothing. He did not soften the parts about the gray activities. He did not minimize the period in New Mexico when he had operated well outside the boundaries of what a good man does. He told it straight and plain and watched her face while he did it. And what he saw there was not what he had feared, which was contempt, and it was not what he had hoped for, which was immediate forgiveness. What he saw was something more complicated and more honest than either of those, which was a woman processing a truth that was both better and worse than the story she had been telling herself for 3 years. "You could have sent word," she said when he had finished. Her voice was quiet now, the fury banked to something steadier and harder to read. "At any point in 3 years, you could have found a way to send me one letter explaining that you were alive. I was afraid that you would come after me." "You were afraid I would come after you," she repeated. "Albert, you were afraid that I would try to help you. I was afraid you would try to help me and that they would hurt you for it." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, through the windows, Caldwell Creek went about its afternoon business with complete indifference to the fact that something was being rebuilt or demolished or possibly both inside this store, and Albert kept his eyes on her face and waited. "You made a decision about what I was capable of," she said at last, "without asking me." "Yes, that was not your decision to make." "No, it was not," she exhaled slowly. "And now you are here because the warrants are being negotiated away. I am here because I needed to know that you had what you needed, the store, the supply chain. Enough credit with the merchants in Wichita to keep the shelves full through winter. I have been making inquiries. I know that the dry goods supplier you used to work with raised his prices last spring, and that you have been paying more than you should for your flour and salt. I know that the building lease is coming up for renewal in October, and that the owner of the lease has been considering selling rather than renewing. I came back to fix those things." She stared at him. "You came back to fix my supply contracts. And the building situation. You rode back into a town where you could still be arrested," she said slowly, "because you were concerned about my flour prices. Among other things." "What other things?" He looked at her directly. "You know what other things?" The afternoon shifted again. The light came back through the windows, warmer than before, and somewhere outside on the main street, a horse shook its head and the bridal hardware rang out bright and clear in the autumn air, and Henrietta Mercer put both hands flat on her counter and looked at Albert Haskins with an expression that he could not entirely read, which was unusual because he had always been able to read her. "You cannot simply come back here and make everything right," she said. "That is not how this works. I know. I spent 3 years rebuilding my life without you in it. I built something solid here. I built something mine. I know, that is why I did not come back earlier. That makes no sense. You needed time to build it. If I had come back before you had, you would have leaned on me before you knew whether you could stand without me. And I needed you to know that you could stand without me." She was silent again, and this silence was a different quality from the earlier ones. It had a different texture to it. "That is the most arrogant thing I have ever heard," she said, "possibly, and the most unexpectedly thoughtful. I had a lot of time to think." She looked at him for a long, measuring moment, the way she had looked at him on the very first day in this very store, assessing, calculating, deciding what weight to assign to what she was seeing. "Frank," she said, without taking her eyes off Albert. The deputy straightened in the doorway. "Yes, ma'am." "Go tell Sheriff Denton that Albert Haskins is in my store and that he is here peacefully, and that I am handling it, and that I would appreciate it if the sheriff would give me until this time tomorrow before he makes any decisions about what to do about it." Frank Colton looked deeply uncertain. "Henrietta, I am not sure that's. Tell him it is a personal matter. Tell him I said so." A pause, then, "Yes, ma'am." The door closed behind him. Henrietta came around the counter. She stood directly in front of Albert, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to look at him fully, and he stood very still the way he always did when he was dealing with something that mattered too much to risk sudden movements. Up close, she could see the full extent of what 3 years had written on his face, and it was considerable, and it was honest, and it made her chest ache in a way that she was not particularly happy about. "Show me what you have," she said, "about the suppliers and the lease." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. Inside were several pages in careful handwriting, names and figures and notations about merchants in Wichita and their current pricing, and 2 alternative suppliers he had identified in Topeka, who were offering significantly better rates for bulk flour, salt, and dry goods. There was a separate page about the building lease, with information about the property owner in Wichita and the fact that his financial situation had recently changed significantly enough that a direct purchase offer, structured correctly, might be more welcome than Albert had originally assumed. She read through it carefully and thoroughly, the way she read everything. He watched her read it. He watched the slight vertical line that appeared between her eyebrows when she was concentrating intensely, which was something he had spent considerable time memorizing in the years when he had nothing better than his memory to work with. "This is good work," she said. "I know it does not fix what I did." "No, it does not." She folded the papers carefully and set them on the counter. "Where are you staying?" "I was going to ride out tonight and camp west of town." "Keep a low profile until the sheriff makes his position clear." "You will not," she said. "You will stay in the back room here tonight. It is dry and there is a cot, and I will not have you camping in the open when there is weather coming." He looked at her. "Henrietta, do not read anything into it except that I have a spare cot and there is weather coming," she said. "We will talk more in the morning when I have had time to process the fact that you are standing in my store looking at me like that." "Like what?" "Like you already know how this ends," she said. "You do not know that yet." "No," he agreed. "I do not." But he thought maybe he did, because she had not sent him away. She had not sent him away, and she had told him about the weather coming, which meant she was thinking about his comfort in the same breath as telling him she was angry with him. And Henrietta Mercer was not a woman who thought about the comfort of people she did not care about. He had always loved her for that economy of feeling, the way she gave her care to exactly the people and things that deserved it, and not 1 degree further. He took care of his horse first, because she had a small stable behind the store where she kept the draft animals she used for deliveries, and there was room for his gelding and fresh hay and water, and he spent time with the horse in the quiet of the stable while the evening came down over Caldwell Creek, and the sky in the west went deep orange and violet, and then finally a very dark blue that was almost green at the horizon. The weather she had mentioned was visible in the northwest, a low dark bank of cloud with a yellow-gray quality that meant rain before morning. When he came back inside, she had closed the store and was in the small living area at the back, which he remembered from 2 years of knowing her, and had spent no small amount of time in during those years. It was exactly as he remembered it, perhaps a little more organized, with new curtains on the window over the dry sink and a good oil lamp on the table that gave off a steady, warm light. She had heated water and there was coffee on the stove, and she set a cup in front of him without asking, because she remembered how he took it. This small, unconscious act of memory hit him somewhere below the ribs. They sat at her table and drank coffee, and she asked him questions that she had clearly been composing while he was in the stable, specific and practical questions about the warrants and the legal process, and the timeline Edmund Graves had given him, and he answered each one directly. She listened with her full attention the way she always had, not filling silences with unnecessary commentary, just listening and processing, and asking the next question when she had absorbed the answer to the current one. "The 3rd County warrant," she said. "What is it for specifically?" "It is associated with a cattle operation outside of Tucson in early 1881. The details are complicated." "Uncomplicate them." He took a breath. "I intercepted a cattle shipment that was being used to transport something other than cattle. The men whose shipment it was filed a complaint with the county sheriff, who happened to owe them a significant personal debt. The warrant is functionally extortionate rather than legally substantive, which is why Edmund believes it will be dismissed eventually, but eventually is doing considerable work in that sentence. She looked at him steadily. So there is still a risk. To you coming here, there is a manageable risk, and you came anyway. Yes. She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her turning something over, examining it from different angles. Tell me about the woman in Santa Fe, she said. He went still. What woman in Santa Fe? You spent 18 months in New Mexico territory. If you are going to tell me everything, Albert, then tell me everything. He met her gaze. There was no woman in Santa Fe. There was no one. In 18 months, I am human. There were evenings. He paused. There was no one who mattered. There was no one I wanted to stay with or return to, or think about past the morning. There was no one who occupied the space that you have occupied in my head since approximately the 3rd week I was in this town. Something in her expression shifted very slightly. That is either the truth or the most well-constructed version of a lie I have encountered, she said. I know which one it is. So do I, she said quietly, and he understood from her tone that she believed him, and the thing that had been tight in his chest since he crossed into Kansas territory began, very slightly, to ease. They talked for another 2 hours. Not exclusively about the hard things, because at some point the conversation shifted in the natural way that it always had between them, and they were talking about the town, about who had married whom and who had died, and what had been built, and what had burned down in 3 years. And she told him about the winter of 1880 that had been particularly brutal, and the roof of her store that had needed replacing in the spring, and the irritating man named Gerald Patterson, who had arrived in Caldwell Creek the previous year, and spent 6 months attempting to purchase her store from her under the apparent impression that she would eventually run out of the energy required to maintain it. What happened to Patterson? Albert asked. I outlasted him. He gave up and went to Dodge City. She paused. Sheriff Denton helped. He made it very clear to Patterson that I was a fixture of this town and that attempts to dislodge me would be viewed with institutional disapproval. I am grateful to Sheriff Denton. He is a good man. She gave Albert a level look. He is also a fair man, which is why I think tomorrow's conversation with him may go better than you are expecting. Or considerably worse. Possibly. She stood and cleared the cups from the table. The cot is behind the curtain. The blankets are in the cedar chest. She paused with her back to him, both hands on the edge of the dry sink, and he watched the line of her shoulders and the way she was holding herself and understood that she was processing things that had not yet resolved into words, and he waited. I am glad you are not dead, she said. I am glad about that myself. That is not forgiveness. I know. Go to sleep, she said. It is late and there is weather coming and we both have a great deal to sort out in the morning. He went to the cot behind the curtain and lay in the dark listening to the rain come in from the northwest, steady and cold against the roof and the walls of the little building. And he thought about the fact that he was here, in this building, 12 feet away from the woman he had spent 3 years protecting from a distance. And the particular quality of relief that produced was so intense that it was almost indistinguishable from grief. He did not think he slept, but he must have, because the next thing he knew the rain had stopped, and there was gray morning light coming through the gaps in the curtain, and Henrietta was in the kitchen area moving quietly, and the smell of coffee and frying salt pork filled the small space with a domestic warmth that made the 3 years of cold, lean, solitary existing feel very distant. Sheriff Denton came at 9 in the morning. He was a compact, deliberate man in his mid-50s, with a gray mustache and eyes that had seen enough of human nature to have developed a certain philosophical distance from its worst aspects. He had been the sheriff of Caldwell Creek for 11 years, and he ran a clean town with a combination of firm authority and practical wisdom that Albert had always respected, even before he had reason to need that respect to be reciprocal. Henrietta made coffee for the 3 of them and they sat at the table in the back room, and Albert told Sheriff Denton what he had told Henrietta about the warrants and the legal process, and the sheriff listened with his coffee in his hand, and his eyes moving between Albert's face and Henrietta's with the careful attention of a man who was reading two conversations simultaneously. "The Garfield County warrant," the sheriff said, when Albert had finished. "I got a notice on that one about 8 months back." "From whom?" "Federal marshal out of Wichita. He was making inquiries." The sheriff studied his coffee. "I told him I had not seen you in 3 years and I did not expect to." A pause. "That was technically accurate at the time," Albert said. "It was." The sheriff looked up. "I am going to tell you something, Haskins, off the record between 3 people in this room. I have been the law in this town for 11 years, and I know when a man is a criminal, and when a man is someone who made criminal-adjacent choices in service of something more complicated. You fall in the second category, in my assessment. That assessment is based on what I knew of you when you were here before, and what I have learned about your recent activities from sources that may surprise you." Albert went still. "What sources?" "A federal agent named Holloway passed through here 6 weeks ago. He was not looking for you. He was looking for information about a network of men that your activities in New Mexico apparently helped to dismantle considerably. He spoke well of your cooperation." The sheriff set his cup down. "I am not a man who throws away useful context." Henrietta was watching the sheriff with an expression that Albert could not entirely read. "Are you telling me," Albert said carefully, "that the situation is more favorable than I understood it to be?" "I am telling you that Caldwell Creek is my jurisdiction, and that I have the discretion to determine what constitutes a threat to public safety in my town. And I am telling you that in my assessment, Albert Haskins sitting in Henrietta Mercer's kitchen drinking coffee does not constitute a threat to public safety." The sheriff stood. "I am also telling you that if the marshal from Wichita comes through asking questions, I will not lie to him, but I see no reason to send him an invitation." He picked up his hat from the table and set it on his head with the deliberate care of a man who wore it as a symbol as much as a garment. "Good morning to you both," he said, and walked out through the store, and Henrietta heard the front door close behind him, and then the silence in the room was very full. "That was not what I expected," Albert said. "Sheriff Denton is not what most people expect," Henrietta said. She was looking at him with that expression he was starting to relearn, the one that contained several things at once, and was not going to resolve into a single simpler thing just because it would be more convenient. "Albert," she said, "I need to ask you something direct." "Ask." "When you say you came back to make sure I had what I needed," she said slowly, "and you mean the supply contracts and the building lease, do you also mean something else by that, or just those things?" He met her eyes. "Not just those things. Say it plain." "I came back because I needed to see you, because I have been surviving for 3 years on the memory of you, and I needed to know whether the real thing matched the memory, and whether there was any possibility that you would let me try to make this right. And I came back because regardless of your answer, you were going to have the supply contracts and the building situation fixed, because you deserve to have those things and my presence should not be the only way you get them." She was quiet for a long time. "The real thing," she said at last, "is considerably more complicated than the memory. I hope you understand that. I am counting on it." She got up from the table and went to the window and stood looking out at the muddy main street of Caldwell Creek, where the morning traffic was beginning, the wagon deliveries and the early riders and the shopkeepers opening their front doors to air out from the night. The rain had left everything clean and bright, and the sky was a particular shade of blue that only appeared in Kansas in the early fall, deep and limitless, and Albert watched her standing in the morning light and felt the specific quality of a man who has walked through a very long darkness and is not yet entirely certain that the light he is seeing is real. "You will need to stay," she said, "if you are serious about this, not forever hiding. Actually stay and deal with the warrant situation properly, and be a visible, known presence in this town. because I will not be involved with a man who is one bad day away from being dragged out of my store in irons. Edmund Graves believes the Garfield County warrant will be resolved within 3 months. Then you have 3 months to demonstrate that you are worth the effort of forgiving, she said. And in the meantime, you can sleep on the cot in the back room and help with the store deliveries and let me decide, on my own schedule, how I feel about all of this. He looked at her back, at the set of her shoulders, at the contained, precise way she occupied space, even in moments of considerable emotional upheaval, and he thought that he had done one right thing in 3 years of mostly difficult decisions, which was to come back to this woman and tell her the truth. "Yes," he said, "I can do that." He did. He stayed. The first week was the hardest because the town noticed immediately. Caldwell Creek was not a large settlement. Its population in 1882 sat at approximately 600 people, which was enough for a main street with a hotel, 2 saloons, a livery, a blacksmith, a physician's office, a small schoolhouse, a church, and several other commercial establishments including Henrietta's general store, but not so large that a new face could arrive unobserved, let alone the face of a man who had been a known quantity in the town 3 years earlier and had left under circumstances that had fueled considerable speculation. The speculation renewed itself with considerable energy. Henrietta managed this with the same practical efficiency she applied to everything, which was to get ahead of it. She told the people she needed to tell directly, including old Mrs. Carmichael, who operated as the town's primary information distribution network, that Albert Haskins was back in Caldwell Creek on legitimate business, that the legal situation was in the process of being resolved through proper channels, and that she would appreciate it if the community would extend the same presumption of good character to a man who was actively working to correct past mistakes that they would wish extended to themselves in comparable circumstances. This speech, delivered in the aisle of her store while simultaneously restocking the bolt cloth section, was reported back to Albert verbatim by the blacksmith, a cheerful large man named Percy Walsh who had apparently been standing behind a display of harness hardware during its delivery. "She is something else," Percy said with considerable admiration. "She is," Albert agreed. He worked hard. He was accustomed to working hard, and he applied himself to every task with the focus of a man who understood that what he was doing was not simply stocking shelves or negotiating supplier contracts. He was demonstrating, through sustained action over time, that he was who he claimed to be now and not who he had been in the difficult years. He corresponded with both of the Topeka suppliers. He had identified and negotiated terms that reduced Henrietta's supply costs significantly. He met with the property owner about the building lease and discovered, as he had expected, that the man's changed financial circumstances made a direct purchase offer attractive, and he presented Henrietta with a detailed breakdown of the purchase versus lease economics, which she studied for 3 days, and then acted on with the decisiveness that characterized her at her best. She was not easy with him. She was not performing difficulty either, the way that people sometimes did to establish a principle. She was genuinely working through something, and she was honest about the fact that she was doing so, which meant that some days they would be talking easily in the comfortable way they always had, and then she would go quiet, and he would see her looking at him with an expression that contained 3 years of accumulated silence, and he would simply wait, because there was nothing else to do and waiting was honest. The 3rd week, she asked him to teach her to shoot more accurately. She already owned the Colt and could manage the basic operation of it, but she had never had proper instruction, and the accuracy was limited. He spent 2 evenings with her in the field behind the stable, setting up bottles on a fence rail in the last hour of daylight, and something about standing behind her and talking her through the mechanics of holding and sighting and breathing and pressing was one of the most unexpectedly tender experiences of his life. She was a quick study. She was always a quick study. By the second evening, she was hitting 4 bottles out of 6 at 20 yards, which was considerably better than most people managed after twice the instruction. "You have a natural instinct for it," he told her. "I have a natural instinct for most things I put my mind to," she said, without particular arrogance, just matter-of-factly. "I know." She turned around and looked at him in the fading evening light, with the smell of gunpowder in the air around them and the prairie going gold and soft in the autumn dusk, and she said, "Why did you never write? Albert, I would not have come after you. I understand that you thought I would, but I am telling you now that I understood the note, even if I hated it. I understood what it meant. I would not have followed you. I would have waited." He took a moment with that. "I know that now," he said. "You did not believe I could make that choice. I believed that asking you to make it was unfair to you, that if you knew I was alive and choosing to stay away, you would spend 3 years waiting for something that might never come, and that was too much to ask. That is not your decision to make," she said for the second time. "You are right. It is not." She looked at him for a long moment. "If you ever do something like this again," she said, "I will be more angry than I was this time, which was already considerable. Understood? Good." She turned back to the fence and raised the revolver and hit the last 2 bottles cleanly, one after the other. He thought he had never seen anything more attractive in his life. October came with the particular cool clarity that makes Kansas beautiful in the fall. The trees along the creek west of town went amber and copper, and the grass went from green to gold, and the sky maintained that deep sustained blue that felt almost like a physical presence. Albert completed the building purchase documentation with the property owner, and Henrietta signed the papers in Sheriff Denton's office with the sheriff as witness. And when the last paper was signed and the deed was officially hers, she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table and breathed in the simple reality of owning the building she had worked in for 7 years. Albert watched her from across the table and felt a pride in her that he recognized as disproportionate to his role in the achievement, which was primarily logistical rather than fundamental, because the fundamental work had been hers entirely. But he felt it anyway. On the walk back to the store, she reached over and took his hand. She did it simply, without announcement, just slipped her hand into his as they walked down the main street of Caldwell Creek in the October morning, and he closed his fingers around hers and kept walking, and neither of them said anything about it because nothing needed to be said about it. It was what it was. That evening, Edmund Graves sent a telegraph message from Santa Fe. The Garfield County warrant had been dismissed. The documentation had come through the federal circuit in Albuquerque, and the dismissal was formal and complete, and Albert Haskins was no longer a wanted man in any jurisdiction in the United States. He read the telegraph message in the quiet of the store after closing, and then he sat with it for a few minutes before he took it to Henrietta. She read it twice. Then she put it down on the counter and looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears but was in the vicinity of them. "It is done," she said. "It is done." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something he had not expected, which was, "I forgive you." The words were simple and direct and entirely in character for her, because Henrietta Mercer did not make dramatic speeches when plain sentences were available, and Albert felt them land somewhere deep and central and necessary. "Thank you," he said. "Do not thank me. Just do not make it necessary again." "I will not." She held his gaze for a moment longer, and then she said, "I think you should know that I have been in love with you for approximately 5 years, and that 3 years of absence did nothing productive to that situation." He crossed the distance between them in approximately 2 steps. The first kiss was not smooth or practiced or cinematic. It was urgent and slightly off-angle, and she laughed against his mouth, which turned it into something better than any version he had rehearsed in 3 years of imagining this moment, because the laugh was real and warm, and was followed by her hands coming up to either side of his face, with a precision and intention that made it completely clear that this was not accidental or ambiguous on her side either. They stood there in the closed store in the October evening with the lamp turned low, and the smell of dry goods and tobacco and old wood all around them. And the 5 years and the 3 years of absence and the fear and the betrayal and the dark past, and the choices made in bad light and the note on the table and the long ride north through Kansas. All of it was still there. All of it was part of what they were, and none of it had gone away. But it sat differently now. It sat like the past, which is what it had finally, properly become. November arrived, and with it a kind of dailiness that Albert had not experienced in years and found almost overwhelmingly good. He made himself useful in ways that were concrete and consistent, the unglamorous steady usefulness of a person who has decided that showing up every day is the most honest form of commitment available. He handled the heavy deliveries and the maintenance of the building, and negotiated with suppliers and helped with inventory in the evenings. And he did all of this without being asked, and without making a point of it, because the point was not the thing. The showing up was the thing. The town gradually adjusted to his presence with the pragmatic flexibility of a frontier community that had seen stranger things than a reformed outlaw working in a dry goods store. Percy Walsh at the blacksmith shop became a genuine friend, a warm and uncomplicated man with no apparent interest in anyone's past. The schoolteacher, a sharp woman named Mrs. Adeline Park, stopped him on the street one day to tell him that she had heard about his work with the federal agent in New Mexico, and that she thought it took considerable courage to do what he had done, and that the town was better for having him in it. He was not entirely sure what to do with this. He thanked her. He thought about it for several days. Sheriff Denton made a point of being visible with him in public contexts, which Albert understood as a deliberate and generous signal to the community that the law had no outstanding objections to his presence. Henrietta watched all of this with the quiet attentiveness she brought to everything, and he knew she was filing away each data point, building her assessment, cross-referencing it against the picture she was building of who he was now versus who he had been, and who he had claimed to be in the back room of her store with coffee on the table and everything at stake. One evening in late November, when the first hard frost of the season had put a silver edge on everything and the store was closed and they were sitting by the small cast iron stove with the wind pushing against the walls, she said, "Tell me what you want." "From what?" "From this, from here, from the future in general." He thought about it, not to compose an answer but to find the actual one, because this was not the kind of question that deserved a composed answer. "I want to stay," he said. "Permanently. I want to build something here. I want to be useful to you and to this town in ways that accumulate over time and amount to a life worth accounting for." He paused. "I want to marry you if you will have me, and I want to be careful to ask you that properly when the moment is right rather than dropping it into a general list." She looked at the fire for a moment. "The moment is pretty good right now," she said. He looked at her. "Henrietta Grace Mercer, will you marry me?" She turned from the fire and looked at him with those direct, clear eyes that had been his North Star for 5 years, whether he was standing in front of her or 2 states away, and she said, "Yes. I believe I will." They were married in January of 1883 in the church on the east end of Caldwell Creek's Main Street, with Sheriff Denton and his wife in the front pew and Percy Walsh standing as Albert's witness, and Mrs. Adeline Park and old Mrs. Carmichael, and about 40 other residents of Caldwell Creek filling the rest of the pews, because the town had decided that this was a wedding worth attending, and they were collectively correct about that. Henrietta wore a deep blue wool dress that she had ordered from a dressmaker in Wichita 4 weeks earlier, and she had her brown hair up with a few pieces escaped around her face in the way they always did regardless of her efforts. And Albert stood at the front of the church in a good black coat that Percy Walsh had apparently organized as a surprise, and watched her walk down the center aisle, and felt the particular quality of a man who has arrived at the place he was supposed to be and recognizes it completely. The minister read the service. The vows were exchanged with simplicity and conviction. When Henrietta said, "I will," She said it in exactly the same tone she used to sign contracts and close business deals, which was to say with absolute certainty and no residual ambivalence, and Albert received it like water after a long, dry crossing. The reception was held in the store itself, which Percy Walsh and a contingent of volunteers had decorated with pine boughs and cotton bunting, and there was food that half the town had contributed, and a fiddle player named James Obert who played well enough that people danced in the cleared floor space between the shelves, and it was the kind of evening that has a particular quality of genuineness. A party that was not performed for appearances, but was simply a real expression of a real community's real pleasure in two people's good fortune. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had gone and the remaining few were engaged in their own conversations, Albert found Henrietta standing near the window with a cup of cider in both hands, looking out at the cold January street with an expression that was calm and warm and privately satisfied, the expression of a person who has accomplished something they are genuinely pleased with. He stood beside her, and she leaned into him very slightly without rearranging herself, just the small natural lean of a person toward a person they trust completely, and he put his arm around her and felt the solid warmth of her, and looked out at the dark winter street of Caldwell Creek, Kansas, which was their town now, both of theirs, and thought that the route he had taken to arrive at this specific moment in this specific place was not one he would recommend as a general approach to achieving happiness. But that arriving was nevertheless extraordinary. Spring of 1883 was a particularly fine one. The winter had been hard but clean, and when the thaw came, it came with a brightness and a generosity that felt like the land itself was in a good mood. The creek west of town ran high and clear, and the cottonwoods along its banks came into leaf with the vivid, particular green of early spring that is greener than any other green in the world. And the store did brisk business as farmers and ranchers who had been saving their spending through the winter came in to restock and purchase the seeds and tools and dry goods they needed for the season ahead. Albert had become, over the winter months, an informal business partner as well as a husband, handling the supplier relationships and the inventory systems with a thoroughness that freed Henrietta to focus on the customer relationships and the more creative dimensions of running the store, which she was considerably better at than he was. Because she had the kind of memory for faces and personal histories that made every person who walked through her door feel like a welcomed and remembered individual rather than a commercial transaction, they were good together in the practical dimension. They had always known they would be, because the practical dimension had been the first dimension they had discovered together, back in those early weeks when he had been finding reasons to linger at her counter, and she had been making observations about the store's operations that were incisive enough to make him pay close attention. But there was something specifically satisfying about seeing it operate at the level of a shared life rather than a courtship, the way two capable people who genuinely respect each other's competence can create something together that is more efficient and more interesting than either of them would produce alone. In May of 1883, Henrietta told him that she was going to have a child. She told him in the morning, before the store opened, standing at the stove with her back to him, and then turning around to face him with the particular quality of a woman who has been sitting with a piece of information for a few days while she decides how to deliver it. She told him in a plain sentence, and then she watched his face. He crossed the room to her in 3 steps and held her face in both hands and looked at her with an expression that she later described to Mrs. Park as being the most comprehensively unguarded thing she had ever seen from a man who spent most of his time with approximately 8% less facial expressiveness than the average person. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "Are you frightened?" "A little. Are you?" "Considerably," he said honestly. But also he stopped. "Also what?" "Also the happiest I have ever been," he said, which was saying something, given that his baseline had shifted dramatically in the past several months. She put her hands over his on her face. "Good," she said. "Then we are frightened and happy together, which seems appropriate." The pregnancy went well. Dr. Hendricks, the town physician, was a competent and reassuring man who had delivered approximately 60 children in his time in Caldwell Creek, and had strong opinions about good nutrition and rest, and avoiding heavy lifting, all of which Henrietta listened to with respectful attention, and then applied with her own modifications based on her assessment of what was actually feasible given the operation of the store. Albert adapted the work arrangements to handle the heavier physical tasks without making a performance of it, simply shifting what needed to shift. The summer was warm and good. They hired a young man named Thomas Reeves, 17 years old and extremely willing to work, to help with deliveries and the heavy stocking, and he turned out to be a genuinely useful addition who took instruction well and showed up consistently, and seemed to understand instinctively that this was a place worth working at. Albert corresponded regularly with Edmund Graves in Santa Fe, partly to ensure that the legal situation remained fully resolved, and partly because Graves had become a genuine correspondent, a literate and thoughtful man who sent letters that were interesting to read. The legal situation remained resolved. There were no further complications. Albert Haskins was, in every jurisdiction in the country, a private citizen with no outstanding obligations to law enforcement, and this fact settled into the background of his life as simply and thoroughly as the fact of clean air settles into the background of breathing. In October of 1883, on a cool, clear afternoon with the sky doing its deep autumn blue again, Henrietta gave birth to a son. Dr. Hendricks managed the delivery and declared both mother and child in excellent health, and Percy Walsh organized a spontaneous celebration at the saloon, which Albert attended briefly before returning to sit beside Henrietta in the room behind the store where she was resting with the baby. They had discussed names. Henrietta had opinions on names, as she had opinions on most things, clear and considered, and not easily redirected. She wanted something that was solid without being heavy, recognizable without being overly common. They named him Daniel James Haskins. Daniel for no particular reason except that it suited him on sight, and James for no reason either except that it completed the name in the right way. Daniel James was from the first day an extremely alert baby, which the doctor said was a good sign. He had Albert's dark eyes and Henrietta's determined quality of attention, and from approximately his second week of existence, he seemed to be studying the world around him, with an interest that Henrietta found gratifying and Albert found privately intimidating, because being studied that intently by a person of that small a size was an unusual experience. The store continued to prosper through the fall and into the winter. The Topeka suppliers that Albert had identified in the original packet of documents proved to be reliable and fairly priced, and the building, now owned outright by Henrietta rather than leased, was a stable physical foundation that made a significant psychological difference in how she thought about the business. She expanded the inventory in a few specific directions, adding a better selection of fabric and sewing notions after determining through careful observation that the women of Caldwell Creek were traveling to Wichita for those purchases when they could be made locally if the selection were improved. Albert began, in the evenings when Daniel was sleeping, to teach himself surveying. He had acquired a surveying instrument and several technical manuals from a dealer in Topeka, and was working through the mathematics and the practical application with the same methodical persistence he brought to everything. The frontier was in the process of formalizing its land arrangements, and a competent surveyor with a trustworthy reputation could find consistent work while remaining based in one location, which appealed to him as a way to contribute economically to their life without requiring extended absences. He was good at the mathematics. He had always been good at mathematics. By spring of 1884, he was accompanying the county surveyor on local assignments, and by the fall of that year, he had established himself as a reliable secondary surveyor for the county, which provided a steady supplementary income and gave him a role in the community that was entirely his own rather than an extension of Henrietta's established position. She was pleased about this. She told him so directly, in the way she told him everything, without ceremony but with complete sincerity. She said, "I am glad you have your own thing here. It suits you." "Everything about this place suits me," he said. "I know," she said. "That pleases me too." Daniel grew the way children grow on the frontier, fast and sturdy, and with an apparently inexhaustible interest in everything. His first word was a pragmatic no, delivered at approximately 11 months with considerable conviction, which Henrietta took as evidence that he had been paying close attention to the right people. By 18 months, he was mobile and curious, and required a level of vigilance that reorganized the household around his movements in a way that both his parents found exhausting and surprisingly entertaining. They were good parents. They were good to each other. They were good to the community, and the community was good to them. And this was not a small thing, because the frontier could be harsh in its judgments and unforgiving in its memory. And the fact that Caldwell Creek had accepted Albert Haskins as one of its own was a form of grace that he did not take for granted. Percy Walsh became Daniel's unofficial godfather, which had not been formally arranged, but had simply evolved from the fact that Percy was enormously fond of the child, and showed up at the store on Saturday mornings with small carved wooden animals that he made in his shop, and Daniel was correspondingly devoted to Percy, which made complete sense because Percy was the kind of person that small children and animals correctly identified as fundamentally safe. In the spring of 1885, Henrietta told him she was expecting again. This time he was less frightened, because the first time had demonstrated that the process was manageable and more simply happy, with a clean and immediate quality of joy that surprised him with its uncomplicated nature. The second baby arrived in November of 1885, a daughter this time, and they named her Clara Rose. Clara because it was Henrietta's mother's name, and Rose because the morning she was born the late October roses that grew along the south wall of the store had been in an improbable second bloom, bright against the graying grass, and Henrietta had looked at them through the window and said the name out loud before they had even discussed it, and Albert had immediately agreed. Clara Rose was different from Daniel in the particular way that children are different from their siblings, fundamentally, temperamentally, from the beginning. Where Daniel had been alert and watchful, Clara was social, interested in faces and voices from her earliest weeks, in the way that some people are simply oriented toward other people as their primary subject of interest from the moment they enter the world. By 1886, the family occupied a house that Albert had built on the lot adjacent to the store, working on it through the second half of 1884 and the first half of 1885, with Percy Walsh and Thomas Reeves and several other men from the town contributing labor on several key weekends. It was a good house, solid and square with a proper foundation, 4 rooms plus a kitchen, with a covered porch along the front, and a kitchen garden in the back that Henrietta had planted with the practical focus she brought to every project worth doing. The store by this point had become something considerably more substantial than the single-woman operation it had been in the years before Albert's return. It had a clear organizational logic, a stable supplier network, a good inventory, a reputation for honest dealing that drew customers from the smaller settlements in the surrounding area, and 2 full-time employees in addition to the owners. Thomas Reeves had become genuinely skilled and was effectively managing the daily operations, with a confidence and competence that meant Henrietta could redirect her own focus to the higher-level decisions without being consumed by the operational details. Albert's surveying work had grown consistently, and he had taken on a formal county appointment in the spring of 1886, which came with a modest salary and the kind of official standing that completed the arc of his reinvention in this place, from a wanted man presenting himself cautiously to a sheriff, to a county officer trusted with the measurement and recording of the land that defined everyone's rights and boundaries. He found this symmetry privately amusing and also privately moving, because it was the kind of outcome that could only happen through the patient accumulation of trustworthy choices over time, which was the lesson he had been learning and relearning since he rode into this town in 1877, with nothing particular to recommend him except that he was not yet the man he intended to become. He was that man now, or close enough to it that the distance was not worth measuring. In the evenings, when the children were sleeping and the house was quiet, and Henrietta was reading by the lamp, with one of the books she ordered from a bookseller in Chicago, and the wind came through the Kansas night with its particular presence, carrying the smell of grass and distance, and the occasional specific cold note that meant winter was thinking about arriving, Albert would sit across from her with his surveying records or his accounts, or sometimes just with nothing, and feel the complete specific weight of a life that had been built rather than simply happened, a life that had required almost losing what mattered most in order to understand what mattered most, and then required sustained honest work to earn it back, and was better for both of those things in ways that a life simply given would not have been. He thought about this sometimes, not obsessively, not with residual guilt, but with the clean clarity of a man who has done his accounting honestly and found it to balance in the end. Henrietta looked up from her book one October evening, with Clara asleep across her lap and the lamp making a warm circle around them both, and she caught him looking at her with that expression, the specific one that she had learned over years of studying his face, the one that meant he was thinking about everything they had come through. "Stop being contemplative," she said. "It is making my reading difficult. You are not looking at your book. I looked up to tell you to stop being contemplative. I am simply happy." She considered this. "Yes," she said. "So am I." She shifted Clara gently and went back to her book, and the lamp burned steady and warm, and the Kansas night went on being vast and dark and full of stars outside the windows of the house he had built, and Henrietta Mercer Haskins turned another page, and everything was exactly right. The years that followed built on themselves, the way good years do. Daniel grew into a boy of considerable intelligence and physical energy, interested in numbers and in horses, and in the surveying work that he would sometimes accompany his father on during the summer months, sitting on a fence rail or a nearby rock, watching with the focused attention that was unmistakably Henrietta's, even in a child's face. Clara grew into someone entirely herself, a girl with strong opinions, and a talent for understanding people that she deployed with a sophisticated instinct that was impressive and occasionally alarming. Percy Walsh taught Daniel to work metal in the blacksmith shop starting at age 6, beginning with the simplest tasks and working upward as the boy's skill and strength developed. And there were Saturday mornings when Albert would look out from the store and see his son in Percy's apron with a look of intense concentration on his face, and feel something so simple and good about the image that he would stand there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. The town of Caldwell Creek grew steadily through the late 1880s, adding residence and commercial establishments and a second church, and eventually a small bank, which transformed the economic life of the community considerably. Albert negotiated the store's banking arrangements with the care he brought to all financial matters, and Henrietta moved the store's accounts and the building equity into an arrangement that provided them with a credit line substantial enough to take advantage of purchasing opportunities when they arose. In 1888, they made their most significant business expansion, purchasing the vacant lot on the other side of the store and building an attached warehouse that allowed them to carry much larger quantities of inventory and to supply other small stores in the surrounding area at wholesale prices. This made the Haskins store the largest commercial operation in Caldwell Creek and established them as a regional supplier rather than simply a town store, which was a transition that Henrietta had been thinking about for several years and had waited to execute until the conditions were precisely right. The expansion required a substantial investment and was the subject of their most significant disagreement of the late 1880s, because Albert had concerns about the timing and the debt load, and Henrietta was certain the timing was right and had the market analysis to support it. And they argued about it with the specific quality of two very capable people who respect each other's intelligence enough not to back down simply because the other person is smart, but who also trust each other enough to continue the conversation past the point where less secure people would have retreated into positions. Henrietta was right. The expansion was successful and had recovered its costs within 18 months, and Albert acknowledged this with the directness he applied to his own errors, which was to say without minimizing them, because he was a man who had learned through considerable difficulty that honest accountability was not the same as excessive self-criticism, and that acknowledging when someone else was right was one of the most efficient forms of respect available. She received this acknowledgment with characteristic economy. "Thank you," she said. "Your concerns were reasonable. I was right, but your concerns were reasonable." "High praise from you," he said. "Very high," she agreed. Silas Croft wrote from Mexico in 1889. The letter arrived in the spring, addressed in Silas's characteristic sprawling hand, and Albert stood at the kitchen table and read it carefully while Henrietta watched him from across the room. It was not a dangerous letter. Silas had apparently found something resembling stability in the years since Albert had extracted him from his difficulties, working as a foreman on a cattle operation south of the border, and the letter was partly a simple communication of the fact that he was alive and not entirely lost, and partly, reading between its lines, an acknowledgment that Albert had paid a considerable personal price to help him, and that this acknowledgment was something Silas had apparently been working up to for several years. Albert wrote back. The reply was not warm exactly, but it was not cold either. It was the reply of a man who had not entirely forgiven the actions that had precipitated everything, but who understood that the entire story, including his own chapter in it, was complicated enough that simple judgments did not quite cover it. He told Silas that he was well and married, and that his legal situation was fully resolved, and he told him sincerely to stay out of the kind of trouble that had brought them to the point they had reached, and he closed the letter with a wish for Silas's continued health, and a finality that indicated this was a closing of a chapter rather than an opening of a correspondence. He showed the letter to Henrietta before he sent it. She read it and handed it back to him and said, "That is the right tone." He folded it and sealed it and posted it the next day, and the chapter truly closed. By the early 1890s, Caldwell Creek had become a genuinely established town, no longer simply a frontier settlement but a community with institutions and history, and the kind of layered social fabric that takes a generation to produce. The Haskins family was woven through this fabric in ways that had accumulated naturally over years of showing up and contributing, and being present for the things that mattered to the community. Albert served a term on the town council starting in 1891. Henrietta did not serve on the council herself, because the formalities of the era did not yet extend voting rights to women in most respects, a fact that she found correctly and consistently objectionable, but she exercised her influence in the community through every channel available to her, which were considerable given her position as a major employer and a trusted presence. She was vocal about this injustice, specifically and in the particular terms that made people uncomfortable in the productive way. She organized a meeting of the women of Caldwell Creek in the spring of 1892 to discuss the formal petition process that suffragist organizations in the larger cities were developing, and she corresponded with women in Topeka and Kansas City who were working on the issue at the state level. Kansas was more progressive than some states on this question, having allowed women to vote in municipal elections since 1887, and Henrietta exercised this right with the thoroughness you might expect, casting an informed vote in every applicable election, and not particularly caring whether this was remarkable or ordinary, because she thought it should be ordinary and operated accordingly. Albert supported this completely and without reservation, because the alternative was to not support it, which would have been both morally wrong and also, practically speaking, something of a choice given who his wife was. Daniel turned 10 in 1893 and had by this point developed a passion for mathematics that exceeded what the Caldwell Creek schoolhouse could provide, and Henrietta began arranging additional instruction through a correspondence program and through occasional trips to Wichita, where a retired teacher named Mr. Francis Beaumont offered advanced lessons to students of exceptional aptitude. Albert drove Daniel to Wichita for these lessons on a roughly monthly basis, and the drives were long enough to produce real conversation, the kind that happens naturally when two people are side by side in a wagon on an open road, with nothing particular to attend to except each other. These drives were something Albert came to value specifically, because Daniel was developing the capacity to ask the kind of questions that required real answers, and Albert had decided early in his parenting that real questions deserved real answers, which meant that over time he ended up telling Daniel quite a lot about his actual history, carefully calibrated to the child's age and capacity. Never in the form of exciting adventure stories, but simply as the honest truth about the consequences of specific choices and the long, unspectacular work of repairing what those choices had damaged. He told him about Selah's Croft. He told him about the 3 years. He told him about the note he had left on Henrietta's table. Daniel listened to all of this with the focused attention that was his characteristic mode, and at the end of the telling he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Did she forgive you?" "She did." "How did she decide?" "She watched what I did after I came back," Albert said. "For a long time." Daniel thought about this. "That makes sense," he said. "Actions are more reliable than words." "You are 10 years old," Albert said. "I know. Is that too young to understand that?" "No," Albert said. "I am simply glad you already understand it." Clara, at 8, was in all respects her own person and showed no signs of becoming anyone else's. She was already deeply interested in the business of the store and would station herself behind the counter on Saturday afternoons with a proprietorial air that made customers smile, and sometimes actually defer to her opinions on which variety of something was preferable. Henrietta watched this with undisguised delight. "She will run this store eventually," Henrietta said one evening, in the matter-of-fact tone she used for observations about things she considered settled. "Only if it is what she wants," Albert said. "It will be what she wants. She already wants it. She wants everything about it." She was right about this, as she tended to be about the people she watched closely. The winters of the early 1890s were not easy. The Kansas frontier in this era was going through significant economic stress, with farm prices depressed and many families in the rural areas around Caldwell Creek stretched to the limits of their resources. The store became, during these years, something that Albert and Henrietta navigated carefully together, because the commercial reality of running a profitable business and the community reality of being in a position to help people in genuine need existed in a tension that required constant, honest negotiation. They extended credit generously to families they knew were temporarily in difficulty, and they managed this credit with care and without condescension, keeping records quietly and not making people feel the weight of obligation beyond what was normal and respectful. Some of this credit was eventually paid back. Some was not, and was not expected to be, and was written off without ceremony. This was expensive. It was also simply right, and neither of them spent much time rationalizing it beyond that. Percy Walsh, who was essentially family by this point, weathered the economic period through a combination of his own careful habits and the loyalty of the farmers who depended on his blacksmithing work regardless of economic conditions. He had never married Percy, and seemed genuinely content with this, having organized his life around work and friendship and his deep affection for the Haskins household, which he visited with the comfortable regularity of a person who knows the door is always open. In 1894, Albert turned 40. Henrietta organized a dinner for the people she thought most deserved to be in the room, which was not a large group but was a specific one, and the evening was warm and unhurried and full of the particular quality of long-standing friendship, the kind built from years of showing up for each other, which is the only kind worth much. After the guests had gone and the children were sleeping, Henrietta and Albert sat on the covered porch in the cool of the early fall evening, and she said, "When you rode into this town the first time, what were you expecting?" "Nothing specific. I was looking for a place to stop moving." "Did you find it?" He looked at the main street of Caldwell Creek, quiet and familiar in the lantern light, and then at her, and he thought about all of it. The note on the table and the 3 years in the dark and the ride back north and the gun at his chest and the coffee she had set in front of him without asking because she remembered how he took it, and everything that had come after, the dailiness and the children and the building purchased outright and the work and the arguments and the forgiveness and the house he had built board by board on the lot next to the store that was their home. "Yes," he said. "I found it." She reached over and took his hand in the dark. "Good," she said. They sat there on the porch for a while longer, the two of them in the Kansas night, with the stars doing what they had always done above the prairie, indifferent and brilliant and entirely present, and the town settling into its nighttime quiet around them, and everything that had ever been lost between them, properly and finally found.